October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos, a name that still stands in true crime history, was executed by lethal injection. Events unfolded in the last 24 hours of her life, in the moments that would shape her legacy forever. Was she ready for the end? Or did she face her final hours with a sense of regret or resolve? Tonight, we look at the last hours of Aileen Wuornos, an ending to a life marked by violence, turmoil, and a trail of unanswered questions that remain long after the world watched as her fate was sealed. For years, the story of Aileen Wuornos captivated the public, a woman who killed 7 men, claiming she acted in self-defense during violent assaults. But who was Aileen really? A broken woman trapped by the circumstances of her past? Or a ruthless killer who took the lives of those she encountered without hesitation? In her final hours, did she reflect on her actions, or was she consumed by anger and bitterness? Her execution was not just the end of a trial, but the conclusion of a larger narrative, a story of abuse, mental illness, and a lifetime of choices that led her to this cold, solitary moment. In her final moments, the world focused on her, trying to understand her. Her words, her demeanor, and the way she carried herself during those last hours held a message. Was it one of remorse? Was it one of resolve? Or perhaps was it a woman simply coming to terms with the end of a life that seemed fated from the very beginning? Aileen's journey through this world was anything but ordinary, and as the clock ticked down on the last hours she would ever experience, the weight of her choices hung heavily in the air. Her life had always been filled with struggle, from a childhood scarred by abuse to a life in and out of the criminal system. Aileen Wuornos' story is also of survival, though a survival that came at a steep cost. She was no longer the woman who had fought against a justice system she believed had failed her. She was just a woman facing the inevitable end of everything she'd known. And as the final moments approached, did she see her life in a new light? Or did she accept the idea of her death as the final escape from a world that had never been kind? This is the true story of Aileen Wuornos, a woman whose last moments would be just as complicated, just as tragic, and just as controversial as the life she had lived. In those final hours, the world would watch, but the questions that remained after the execution would stay unanswered forever, leaving the world to wonder, who was Aileen Wuornos really? Aileen Wuornos, a name that still stirs a mixture of fear, confusion, and fascination. Her story has captivated the public's attention for decades, drawing in those who seek to understand the mind of a killer and the tragic circumstances that led to her life of crime. Aileen Wuornos, a woman who murdered 7 men between 1989 and 1990, claims she killed them in self-defense, asserting that they had attempted to assault her while she was working as a prostitute. Her words were met with skepticism, but they also ignited a nationwide debate about the concept of survival versus the act of murder. The questions surrounding her motives, her mental state, and her guilt are still raised to this day. Was Aileen Wuornos a victim of her circumstances, or was she simply a cold-blooded killer? The case remains one of the most talked about in the history of American crime. Aileen's life didn't start out with the promise of a bright future. She was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. From the very beginning, her life was filled with neglect and dysfunction. Her mother, unable to care for her, abandoned her shortly after birth, leaving Aileen to be raised by her grandparents. But the abuse didn't stop there. Her grandfather was a known child molester, and Aileen was his victim. By the time she was a teenager, she had experienced physical and emotional torment, forcing her into a harsh existence where survival was the only thing that mattered. With little education, no family support, and no guidance, Aileen turned to prostitution in order to make a living. and it was during this time that her violent tendencies began to emerge. Could her crimes have been prevented? Or was she simply a product of a broken system, a system that offered her no opportunities for escape? As we look back at the period between 1989 and 1990, Aileen's killings seemed to happen in quick succession. The first murder occurred on November 3rd, 1989, when she shot and killed Richard Mallory, a man who had picked her up while she was working as a prostitute. Aileen claimed that he had attempted to rape her, and she acted in self-defense. Her second victim, as well as the subsequent 5, met similar fates. Some believed her, while others saw her as a ruthless killer, a woman who took the lives of men with no remorse. But Aileen's story became more than just a series of murders. It became a complicated narrative of abuse, mental illness, and self-preservation. Her defense was that she was simply trying to survive in a world that had failed her. But her actions painted a much darker picture. How much of her story can be attributed to trauma, and how much of it is simply a reflection of her own choices? The line between victim and perpetrator can be difficult to see in Aileen's case. By 2002, Aileen Wuornos had spent over a decade on Florida's death row. Her case had become a media spectacle, and many people were fascinated by the woman who had killed so many men. For years, Aileen had been a source of intense controversy. Some believed she was the victim of an unjust system, a woman who had been forced to kill in order to defend herself. Others saw her as nothing more than a cold-blooded murderer, a woman who had taken the lives of those she encountered with little to no hesitation. Yet, as the years passed, Aileen's emotional state became a key part of the story. Was she truly mentally ill, or was she simply playing the role of a victim in order to avoid the death penalty? And did she face her final days with a sense of regret, or did she stand by her actions until the end? On October 8th, 2002, the night before her execution, Aileen was already spending her final hours on death row at Florida State Prison. She had been waiting for her fate for over 10 years, but as the hours ticked down, there was little doubt in anyone's mind that her execution was coming. By this time, Aileen had become something of an enigma. She had been the subject of countless interviews, documentaries, and even films. Yet much of the public still didn't fully understand her. She had been both vilified and romanticized in the media, with some seeing her as a victim and others as a monster. But in the quiet of the night, as the world outside carried on, Aileen spent her final moments preparing herself for the inevitable. It wasn't just the weight of her crimes that weighed on her mind. It was the reality that this was the end. No more appeals, no more chances. The clock was ticking, and she knew. As she waited, Aileen had one last opportunity to speak with her lawyer, Jim. Jim had represented her through much of her legal battle, tirelessly working to delay her execution and find any possible way to save her life. Despite the odds stacked against them, Jim never stopped trying to fight for her. Their conversations that night were a mix of legal matters and personal exchanges. Aileen knew there was no hope left for a last-minute reprieve, but there was still something in her voice, a sense of resignation mixed with acceptance. Her words weren't filled with rage or bitterness, but rather with a quiet resolve. She knew what was coming, and in those final hours, she had come to terms with it. Aileen's personality had always been described as volatile, sometimes erratic, but in those final moments, there was a calmness about her. Perhaps it was the realization that nothing could change her fate. Perhaps it was the acceptance of an end that had been years in the making. Late into the night, as the prison lights dimmed and the guards made their rounds, Aileen had one final phone call with Jim. It was brief, but it would be the last time she would communicate with anyone on the outside. The conversation was simple, and to some, it may have seemed ordinary. But for Aileen, it marked the final exchange of words with a world that had never fully understood her. Was there any hint of remorse in her voice? Did she regret the lives she had taken, or did she stand by her actions? Jim would later say that the conversation felt more like a quiet farewell than a desperate plea for mercy. Aileen wasn't asking for anything in those last moments. She wasn't pleading for her life. Instead, she seemed resigned to the truth that there would be no more chances, no more delays. The end was near. As the hours passed, the tension in the air grew. Aileen was prepared to face her fate. There would be no miracles, no sudden changes. As dawn broke, she would be led to the chamber that would end her life. It's hard to know exactly what went through her mind in those final moments. Was she haunted by the lives she had taken? Did she feel sorrow for the pain she had caused? Or was she, as she had always claimed, simply someone who had done what was necessary to survive? The questions remain unanswered. But one thing is clear. Aileen Wuornos' final moments were a culmination of a life that was anything but ordinary. A life defined by abuse, survival, and ultimately, death. October 9, 2002 was the day Aileen Wuornos had been waiting for, and yet it came with a sense of inevitability. She had spent over a decade on Florida's death row, and now, in the quiet of the early morning, the moment of execution was drawing near. The hours leading up to her death were filled with tension as the final moments of her life unfolded. From the time she awoke to the time she walked the cold concrete floor toward the execution chamber, Aileen's actions and interactions would give us a glimpse into her emotional state, what was going through her mind in those final, haunting hours. She woke up that morning with little fanfare, the weight of her fate now firmly in her mind. There was no sense of surprise or shock. Aileen had known this day would come for years. The guards, those who had seen her day in and day out, noted that she seemed calm, even resigned. She had no visitors, except for her lawyer Jim, who arrived to speak with her one final time. The conversation was brief, but significant. Jim had been with Aileen through her long and complicated legal battle. He had attempted to delay her execution through every possible avenue, but today even he knew that nothing would stop it. He tried to offer comfort, though it seemed futile. It was a final, desperate act of kindness in a situation where kindness could do nothing. As the morning passed, it became clearer that this was no ordinary day for Aileen. She had spent her final hours reflecting on her life, perhaps on the choices she had made, the men she had killed, and the justice system that had sentenced her to death. What was going through her mind? Was she regretting her actions, or was she still convinced that she had acted in self-defense? She had always claimed that her killings were a direct response to men trying to assault her. Some believed her, others did not. But in her last hours, did she reflect on those claims? Did she feel remorse for taking lives? Or was she still angry, frustrated with the system that had condemned her? The final visit from Jim came in the afternoon, just hours before the execution. He was one of the few people Aileen had trusted during her time on death row. Over the years, they had developed a relationship built on legal strategy, but also on understanding. Jim had fought tirelessly to delay her execution. He had worked to get her the mental health evaluations she needed, knowing full well that her mental state was unstable. Still, Jim's visit this time was different. This was not a meeting to discuss appeals or legal motions. It was, in essence, a farewell. Jim would later describe the final moments of their conversation as filled with quiet tension. Aileen did not ask for a reprieve. She did not beg for mercy. She simply spoke of her fate with a resignation that seemed to define her final days. The tone in her voice was not one of defiance, but of acceptance. A woman preparing for what was inevitable, knowing there would be no more chances. Traumatic past. But even with these diagnoses, it was unclear how much they had shaped her actions and how much they influenced her final days. Was she fully aware of the weight of her crimes, or had she come to terms with them in a different way? The complexity of her mental state remained a topic of debate right up until the end. The guards prepared her for the walk to the execution chamber. There was no ceremony, no dramatization, just the cold, clinical routine of the prison system. In the early morning hours, Aileen was shackled and escorted down the long corridor. The concrete floor beneath her feet seemed colder than it had ever felt before, and the sound of her footsteps echoed through the silent halls. Aileen said very little to the guards. She didn't speak to anyone. As she walked toward the execution chamber, her mind must have been filled with so many thoughts. Thoughts of the life she had lived, the people she had hurt, the actions she had taken. But as she walked, there was no display of emotion, no cries for help. She walked toward her death with a silence that would haunt those who witnessed it. Now, Aileen entered the execution chamber. She was faced with a final moment of clarity. The guards secured her to the gurney, and the process of execution began. Before the drugs were administered, Aileen made her final statement, and in those last words, she would say, "I'd just like to say I'm sorry to the people I've hurt, and I hope that they understand the truth about what happened." The significance of these words has been widely debated. Some believe it was a moment of true remorse and acknowledgement of the lives she had taken. Others saw it as an attempt to mitigate the damage caused by her actions, a final effort to present herself as more than a killer. Was Aileen genuinely sorry for what she had done, or was she simply trying to craft a narrative in her final moments? Her words left the world with more questions than answers. Some of those who followed her case, from the public to legal experts, have argued that Aileen's final statement was a mix of guilt and defensiveness. It's difficult to say if she was truly remorseful or if her apology was another attempt to explain away her crimes. But what's undeniable is that in her final moments, Aileen Wuornos was not the same person who had been convicted of 7 murders. She had faced her past, her future, and her fate. And in the end, Aileen's death was as much a reflection of her life as her crimes were. A life filled with pain, violence, and regret. The execution had been long in the making, but still, the tension in the air was palpable. The drugs were administered, and Wuornos's life began to slip away. There was no turning back now. Yet, for all the finality of her death, something remained unsettled, something that many felt was still left unfinished. But was Aileen Wuornos really guilty, or had she been a victim of this system, a woman caught in a cycle of abuse, trauma, and mental illness? Over the years, there had been heated debates about whether she was truly responsible for the murders of 7 men, or if her actions had been a desperate cry for help, a response to years of suffering at the hands of men who had exploited and abused her. To some, she was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer, someone who murdered in cold blood, motivated by anger, fear, or perhaps something darker. Yet, to others, Aileen was a victim herself, a victim of a broken system, of society's failures, and of a justice system that didn't fully recognize the complexities of her life. Was she simply reacting to the dangers she faced as a woman on the streets, forced into prostitution to survive? Or was she a product of her past, her troubled upbringing, her history of abuse, the mental illness that some said had been left untreated for far too long? Some people, including those who knew her personally, claimed that Wuornos had never received the full mental health care she needed. They argued that her troubled history, her traumatic experiences, her struggles with borderline personality disorder and PTSD were factors that had led her to a place where violence seemed like the only option. Her lawyers and supporters had insisted, right up until her execution, that she wasn't fit to stand trial. They argued that Aileen had never had a fair chance, and that the punishment she faced was too harsh for someone whose mental state had been compromised from an early age. But then there was the flip side. There were those who insisted that she had been entirely aware of what she was doing, that her actions were calculated, that her confessions to the murders had been chillingly self-assured. These critics pointed to her courtroom demeanor, her statements to the press, and her lack of visible remorse. To them, Aileen was not the tragic figure that others believed her to be. She was a murderer who deserved what she got. The drugs began to take their effect, and Aileen's life slowly ebbed away. Some wondered if her execution was the final, just end to a dark chapter in American crime history. But even in that moment, questions lingered. Was it truly justice? Or was it the culmination of a broken system that had failed her just as much as it had failed the victims of her crimes? Did Aileen deserve the death penalty? Was she truly a danger to society? Or was she a broken woman, broken by years of trauma and abuse, struggling to survive in a world that had given her few options? Was her death a form of justice, or was it a tragic end to a much larger story that had been lost in the headlines? For all the attention her case received, for all the public discussions and debates, there was still so much we don't know, so much we may never know. Some say that the truth will never come to light, that the answers to these questions will remain buried, just like the details of Aileen's final hours. Perhaps we will never truly understand the full scope of her life, her actions, and the forces that led her down the path she took. But there's one thing that is certain. Aileen Wuornos' story did not end with her execution. We are now left with more questions than answers. Was she truly guilty of the crimes she was convicted of? Or was she simply a product of her past? Someone shaped by years of trauma, abuse, and neglect. Did she have the capacity for true remorse? Or was her final apology just another attempt to rationalize her actions in a world that had never shown her kindness? And what about the system that sentenced her to death? Was it fair? Was it just? Many still argue that Wuornos was a victim in her own right, a woman who had faced unimaginable hardships, forced into a life of violence and survival. Some believe her actions were driven by desperation and fear, not malice. Was she truly the monster society made her out to be? Or was she just a broken person who snapped under the weight of her own pain? The debate continues to rage, and it's not something that will easily be resolved. Now we turn the question over to you. What do you think? Was Aileen Wuornos guilty, or was she a victim of circumstance, lost in a system that never truly understood her? Could things have turned out differently if she had received the help she needed? Or do you believe she deserved the punishment she received, regardless of her troubled past? There's no easy answer. It's a complex case, and everyone has their own perspective. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What are your theories about Aileen's actions? Do you think justice was served? And what does her case say about the way we treat people who have been through trauma, abuse, and neglect? Your voice matters. This is a conversation worth having. And if you're fascinated by true crime cases like Aileen Wuornos' stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, morality, and the human condition, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on more gripping, untold stories that will keep you at the edge of your seat. We've got many more cases to explore, and we can't wait to share them with you. So let us know in the comments. Did Aileen Wuornos deserve the death penalty? Was she a product of her environment? Or was she something more dangerous? We're eager to hear your thoughts, and as always, thanks for being part of this journey with us. Over the years, many theories have emerged to explain Aileen Wuornos' motives, but the truth remains elusive. Some believe her crimes were the result of a lifetime of suffering and abuse. They argued that she wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but rather a woman who had been deeply scarred by her past. Aileen's history was filled with trauma, from her early years when she was abandoned by her parents to the years of abuse she suffered at the hands of men. She was a prostitute, forced into a life she never chose, vulnerable to the very dangers she ultimately faced. Many point to this as a key factor in her actions. Some argue that Aileen was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a mental health condition that can manifest after someone has endured severe abuse or trauma. Those who support this theory suggest that the violence she committed was not an act of malice, but a reaction to a life of exploitation and fear. Others, however, take a different view. They see Aileen Wuornos as a ruthless predator, someone who, rather than being a victim, became an aggressor. These critics argue that Wuornos took advantage of vulnerable men, targeting them on the roads where they would be most at risk. They suggest that she murdered not out of fear, but out of a desire for control, power, and revenge. According to this perspective, her actions were not defensive, but calculated. They were, in their view, cold and deliberate, and they point to the way she confessed to the murders as evidence that she knew exactly what she was doing. But where does the truth lie? Was Wuornos a woman who acted out of sheer desperation and fear? Or was she someone who preyed on those she saw as easy targets? Was she simply trying to protect herself from the same men who had hurt her all her life? Or was there a darker side to her nature, a side that no one was ready to acknowledge? Experts who have examined Wuornos' mental state over the years continue to debate her true motivations. Some believe that her traumatic childhood and years of abuse left her psychologically broken, unable to process her emotions in a healthy way. Others believe that Aileen knew exactly what she was doing and that her history of violence, both as a prostitute and as a killer, was evidence that she was not a victim of circumstance, but rather a product of her own actions. In fact, some have pointed to her behavior during her trial as a key factor in their conclusion. Aileen was often described as erratic, combative, and unpredictable, traits that some believe pointed to a deeper psychological issue. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and some experts believe that this disorder may have contributed to her violent outbursts and her inability to form healthy relationships. Aileen herself frequently spoke of her anger toward men, a sentiment that she seemed to carry throughout her life. Was this anger justified? Was she, in a sense, lashing out against a world that had never given her a chance? Or was she simply using her past as an excuse for her actions? At the same time, legal experts have questioned the fairness of her trial and her execution. Some argued that Wuornos was never given a fair chance to defend herself, particularly in light of her mental health issues. Her supporters claim that the justice system failed to take into account the years of abuse and trauma she had endured. They also questioned the role of her legal team, who were accused of not adequately preparing for her defense. And then, of course, there's the question of her mental competence at the time of her trial. Was she fit to stand trial? Did she fully understand the consequences of her actions? Experts in the field of criminal justice have pointed out that the death penalty is often applied inconsistently, with some arguing that it is used to punish those who society deems undeserving of compassion, rather than to administer true justice. Many felt that Wuornos' execution was the culmination of a broken system, one that failed to recognize the complexity of her mental state and the circumstances that led to her crimes. But no matter where you stand on the issue, one thing is clear. Aileen Wuornos' case raises difficult questions about the intersection of mental health, trauma, and the justice system. Was she a victim of her circumstances, or was she a cold-blooded killer? Was her past an excuse, or was it the reason she became what she was? And most importantly, did she deserve to die for her actions, or was there another path, a different kind of justice that could have been pursued? The truth may never be fully known. Some will always see her as a victim. Others will always see her as a murderer. But what we can say for certain is that Aileen Wuornos' story doesn't fit neatly into any box. It's not a simple tale of right and wrong, of good versus evil. It's a story of a woman who was broken in ways that most of us can't imagine, and a woman who, for better or worse, left an indelible mark on the world. But as the story of Aileen Wuornos comes to an end, it's clear that the case still resonates. It's a case that forces us to think deeply about who we are, about the things we overlook, and the people we fail to understand. The story of Aileen Wuornos may have ended with her execution, but there are countless other stories out there, stories of people who, like Aileen, found themselves trapped in a system that never gave them a chance. Stories of crime and tragedy that often go untold. And so we'll keep exploring, keep questioning, keep searching for the truth that lies beneath the surface. So stay with us as we continue to investigate the untold stories of the criminal world, stories that, like Aileen's, ask us to consider the human cost of the justice system and the price we pay when we fail to see people for who they really are. And if you want to be part of that journey, don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. We've got more true crime mysteries coming your way, and we want you to be there every step of the way. And remember, leave your thoughts on Aileen Wuornos in the comments below. We're eager to hear your take on her story, the justice system, and everything in between. Your voice matters.